I was surprised to learn recently that Super Earth has this canonical map. I'm not gonna lie to you, when I initially looked at this map, I was a little horrified, and got flashbacks to the terrible Harry Potter school maps. Let's try to work out how this happened. Like, you see this border? What in God's name happened here, huh? There's a lot of things to go over here, and I think it's important to keep in mind at the forefront that Helldiver's world isn't really meant to be like a utopia. It's inherently a parody, and so this world was, presumably, made with that in mind too. This video is not really like a deconstruction of Arrowhead's world-building choices. Think of it more like, you wake up from about 500 years of cryo-sleep, walk over to your hollow globe, get greeted with this map, and then are trying to piece together how this happened. I'll admit, it's actually not as ridiculous as you might think, especially after looking at Sector 5. What immediately jumped out to me was how weird the sector numbers were. Oceania is sector number 1, the capital is in sector 3? How did Oceania become a major power capable of uniting the world? We're gonna have to go deep into speculative ops on this one, so try to stay with me. I want to go into what exactly I think happened historically on Earth to make the borders that we have now in Super Earth. Specifics are gonna fall by the wayside because it's a 500-year period between real life and when the game happens, and trying to predict any of that detail is basically pointless. To not waste too much time, I'm going to assume that you, the viewer, have at least a basic understanding of geopolitics and geography. If you don't, you can follow along with Google Earth, it's not that hard. Also, maybe crack open a history textbook and stop looking at YouTube shorts. To get the elephant out of the way, it does seem the North Pole got nuked. Most of the northern parts of the Earth are uninhabitable, as well as the UK, Ireland, and Ukraine. I'm not really sure why the North Pole of all places would be targeted apart from as a weapons demonstration or a threat, maybe? Regardless, it seems the Ukrainian conflict that's happening in our world today has escalated significantly, probably with Ukraine getting nuked as well as the British Isles before NATO subdued Russia, probably with the help of China. The reason I think China was involved is because what we know today as Russia is pretty clearly divvied up between the third and second sectors, which represent Europe and China respectively, as opposed to Russia being taken over wholly by Europeans. So I think the Ukrainian conflict escalated and that led to the EU and China teaming up to wipe out Russia. After that was over, the broad strokes NATO coalition seemed to have split their territory into the first 4 sectors. The first being Oceania, second being mostly China, plus a few others like Mongolia, and then the EU split in 2, with Sector 4 being the majority of the EU and Sector 3 branching off to serve as their capital and administrative center. Because large parts of Sector 4 also include African states, it's probably a fair bet to assume that at some point before or after the Russian conflict, the EU pressured some Western and Northern African states to join up as well. At this time, Prosperity City, what would become the capital of the Federation, was just Administrative Center 01, with 02 just across the border. We can reasonably assume it became Prosperity City later on, because otherwise they'd have just named Admin Center 02 to 01 instead, and Prosperity City was likely renamed probably when the Federation gained full planetary control, as opposed to essentially being a burgeoning, if massive, nation-state. This new nation, stretching from Zealand to New Zealand, would have left a lot of states from South Africa to India kind of surrounded, and those would become Sector 5. Sector 5 was what made me initially worried when I saw this map, as it seems like the most Anglo-centric border ever devised. But I'd like to propose that all of these nations saw this new burgeoning federation between the EU and China, saw their combat prowess proven in Russia, and decided, probably wisely, to, almost certainly hesitantly, join up together as one big sector. This way, they presumably got to retain a lot of autonomy and don't get divvied up by the major powers that are directly on their doorstep. Essentially, this border wasn't crafted by British people drawing borders that they didn't really understand the consequences of. I think it's instead the result of an incredible amount of geopolitical pressure forcing a bunch of states to band together to, well, preserve themselves. The sector numbers back this up too, as 5 would be the next in line after the first founding 4. The remaining 2 sectors, 6 and 7, are the Americas, and they're very weird. Looking at population counts today, Sector 5 would have just about 40% of the entire world's population count in its borders, which is in the realm of about 3 billion people. Sector 7 is dramatically lower, it'd have under 500 million, or 6% of the world's population, which, needless to say, is a pretty gigantic discrepancy. Even Sector 6, which is all of South and Latin America, as well as a lot of the southernmost US states, is not even kind of scratching the monolithic population numbers of Central Asia. The reason I think these are weird, though, is because, well, first off, I live here. Like, in real life. In today's world, there ain't no way people from San Diego to Miami are gonna be okay with being ruled by a narco-capitalist man. That makes me think that this land wasn't exactly given kindly, especially because Sector 6 is so huge. I think there was probably a South American warlord who swept between South and Latin America at some point. They were likely Argentine, given that the capital of what would become Sector 6 is Remembrance, which is Buenos Aires in real life. As this Argentinian empire got to biting at America's heels, Sectors 1 through 5 had presumably been founded, uniting Afro-Eurasia together. This Federation of Nations offered to intervene as Argentina was on the door of the continental US, and either through genuine diplomacy or through intimidation, proposed the borders that we see now, giving huge swaths of the southern United States as concessions to the South American warlord in exchange for both of the Americas being brought into the fold that would become Super-Earth. They agreed, likely because they had no other choice, and so the Americas joined the Federation of Super-Earth as Sectors 6 and 7. This leaves me with a few unanswered questions about the state of the world, the first of which is, what exactly happened to America's military presence, especially because Super-Earth is clearly modeled after American patriotism? Well, first things first, the world of Helldivers was made before the election of the current God King was even a twinkle in our eye, so I'm going to try to keep references to the current administration at a minimum. We can pretty safely assume, though, that the US stopped being a global superpower. That is not exactly unheard of. Britain lost its superpower status once the rest of the world caught up to them technologically and then surpassed them industrially. Over here in the States, to decapitate our industry, you would pretty much have to wipe off the entire continental US, so it's probably a safe bet that it was a technology problem. It is not exactly a new phenomenon that R&D is supercharged in times of war, and the rest of the world would have been going through it, to say the least. A South American warlord united their continent was running up through Latin America, and Russia would have had been strangle-held after making an entire country uninhabitable. If America was simply watching at the sidelines, which we have a tendency to do in world wars, it makes sense that American wartime industry and technology sectors would have been left behind relative to their counterparts across the Atlantic and down south. If the US was feeling a little isolationist while the rest of the world was duking it out, it makes sense that the US would find themselves outmatched when managed democracy came to their door. Essentially, I think it's a safe bet that in the Helldivers world, China took over the US's role as like a global world watchdog, given how the winds are currently going today, with China installing like 100 solar panels per second, while the US is defunding new technology. I can see it. It makes sense. Well, given how overpowering the US military is today, saying it makes sense might be a bit of a stretch, but it is at the very least plausible. If this is the case, why is China not the capital of the Federation? Well, because the developers are from Stockholm. They put themselves at the center of the world for fun. Another question that looking at this map left me was, what was the last Great War? The only concrete details we have on the last Great War are the wasteland zones that it left uninhabitable. It seems like a fair bet that given they are around the North Pole, Ukraine, and the UK, the last Great War was probably the war between NATO and China versus Russia. The UK didn't make it, I guess. It makes sense that this would be called the last Great War if it formed a federation, as it's meant to symbolize like all of humanity coming together and not fighting each other anymore. It's the last one because they're all together under one banner now. Now, why exactly was the North Pole nuked? I have no goddamn clue. Realistically, if it was nuked, the oceans would be way, way higher and a lot of the coastline would be swallowed, so I have to assume some measure to stop that was put into place. The optimistic, hopeful interpretation of this is that a solution to climate change was found, they found a way to stop the ice caps from melting, and they stabilized the climate. The more depressing interpretation is that they just put up a really big wall on all the coastlines and called it a day. Given that there are still massive uninhabitable zones on the Earth, I suspect it is probably not the optimistic read. That aside, how did the invasion of Super-Earth change things? It didn't, really. Borders didn't move, at least. A few wonders of the world got destroyed, but that's about it, really. Bit underwhelming, to be honest, given that almost all of the world supposedly fell. Even though the rainforests are gone, they're only gone in theory. Helldivers planets aren't actually capable of being multiple biomes. Every planet is the same biome across the whole surface, and so in-game, Super-Earth's entire planet, including Antarctica, looks like a jungle, so we can safely say the ecosystem is fine enough. To be honest, I have some reservations about these borders, but it is refreshing to see a super city in Indonesia, as it's a very realistic place for one to grow, instead of just being in some place like Sydney. I think if I tried to offer up better borders, it would just get me hunted down, so I'm not even going to try to go there, but if you feel like making enemies, you can go ahead and tell me how to fix this in the comments. I, at the very least, can confidently say that Sector 5 is horrific, especially with its city being like Cairo. Did we just force a mass exodus out of India to go live in the desert, or like, what happened with that? Thanks to my patrons, Emmy and Potato especially. Like, comment, subscribe, you know the drill. And why on earth did they nuke the North Pole?